Hi everyone, we're doing the online lecture for leadership today. Thank you for your patience with me getting this up there. I've had a couple flooding incidences in my apartment, and a lot of people were coming in and out during these snow days. So I hope you all have had good snow days. Mine have been okay, but I hope you all have had good ones. Today we're talking about leadership, and this is not going to last as long as a class lecture would last. You all have some of the shell of this lecture, so go ahead and figure out what you're missing from your slides from this lecture and go ahead and fill it in. I'd recommend going back to the textbook and filling in the things that we don't cover, because like every class, we can't cover it all. So go ahead and read that chapter and fill in those slides for yourself as well. Additionally, there's one other thing on D2L that I would have had you do in class, so if you're interested in doing that, and it's included within this lecture, and so I'll bring it up later, but if you are interested in doing that, go ahead and access that, and it's a little measure to see what type of leader you are. Then that'll be fun to do, and we can talk about it later. A couple questions. The exam is still going to be on Tuesday, and the reason is because I don't believe that we are going to be too far behind, and hopefully everybody will have access to this. And Greg and I will be available on Monday as well for questions, and Tuesday earlier in the day. So if you have any questions between now and then, just let me know and let Greg know, and do me a favor and CC us both so we know what's going on. All right, so let's jump right into it. So if we're to define leadership, a lot of the time what we do is we kind of mix up what a leader is and what a manager is. So the definition you see here is what leadership is. Okay, so certainly leaders need to be managers, but leaders are influencers. That's the key difference between the two. Okay, so leaders influence a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So you can see a piece there has to do with being a part of a team, right? Pursuing that common goal. And so leaders or leadership inspires or influences a group of people to move in the direction towards achieving that goal. Okay, so obviously we know that I'm going to guess that many of you have been leaders in some fashion, whether it was on a team, whether it was in a group project, whether it's within your own family and among your siblings. But leaders do a lot. So leaders have big jobs, there's big tasks. So you can see what they have to do is some of these things within this list down here underneath what leaders do fall under things that maybe are more influential while others are more managerial. So you can see that things like making decisions and then giving feedback, some of those things are pretty managerial, but things like creating a sense of vision for the group, that's very influential and more inspiring. So just think about if you have been a leader or you've known a very good leader, what are some of the things that they have had to do? And I'm going to guess that you come up with a long list, and then maybe we think for a second, okay, being a leader is a little bit tougher. So we tend to ridicule leaders a lot. So just keep that in mind, that they have to do a lot. And what you see on the right is that this little diagram of 3 circles. And basically what this is the way that I understand who's involved in leadership. So you certainly have the leader, which you see in the blue circle, and then you have the followers. So if we're thinking about an athletic team, maybe we have a team captain, and then we have the rest of the players on the team. So the team captain would be our leader, and then the other players would be our followers. The third piece is the leader and follower dyad. So that's like the relationship between the leader and the followers. So how do all 3 of these things interact to create great leadership within a team? Those are the ways that I understand it. Okay, now everybody always wants to know how we're going to find that perfect leader. So what do we do? How do we find it? Well, there's really 2 things that we need to consider, and this is similar to something we talked about in class last time when we were talking about group structure. But identifying leaders can happen in 2 ways. So either leaders are prescribed, which we mean is like an appointed leader. So a captain, we vote for the captain. Or they are emergent, meaning they just kind of organically become leaders. So I gave the example of in class when we were talking about group roles, and I said being a captain is a role. And, sometimes they can be voted in, and then other times they can happen organically, and they can be that person that everybody goes to for support. Although they don't have that badge or they don't wear that that C on their chest or anything like that. So there's two ways. Think about if you can come up with some examples for how leaders are prescribed and how they occasionally just emerge. Okay. I already mentioned this a little bit on the previous slide, but the functions of the leaders. So leaders do a lot, but their primary functions, so their primary jobs, are really twofold. So the first one is to make sure that what they're doing as a leader meets what the organization needs. So at that higher level. So if you're within a team, the big picture within their sport, how does it satisfy what they need? And then you go down to the more narrow needs of the group. Okay, so how are they meeting the needs of the group? If we want to think about the President of the United States, they have a lot of organizational demands to satisfy, and then you go down to the next level, and it's more of a focus on what the people of the United States need and how they're satisfied. Okay, so leaders have to do a lot of stuff. They have to do a lot of things to meet those functions. So now what we're doing is we're segueing into different leadership approaches, and I'm going to break this up into a few. So there's probably 4 or 5, I think, that I'm going to discuss here. But the first 3 that I discuss are the trait approach, behavioral approach, and the situational approach. Now, when we combine all of these approaches, that's known as the interactional approach, right? So when we think of leadership, we don't often think that there are actual models or approaches or theories or things like that, but that's what we're covering today. So we're going to discuss those different things and how we can understand leadership through those models. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the trait approach. Okay, so the trait approach is that whole idea that you're born a leader. If you're born a leader, that's considered the trait approach because you are born and you have all those traits, all those qualities or stable personality dispositions that make you a good leader. No matter what situation you're in, no matter who you're around, no matter what, you're going to be the leader. Okay. So there are some really, really key examples of people in our world that we believe are leaders no matter what. And I would say that one of those that's been very common in the past year and before is LeBron James. So LeBron is certainly a leader on the basketball court. He's some would argue the GOAT, right? He's a great player, but he's also a leader. But you take LeBron James off the court, and you can see that he's also a leader in advocating for young people's education. He's kind of this man that people think can do it all. And not only can he do it all, he'd probably rise to the top as a leader. And I know I'm generalizing LeBron's ability, but it's an example that probably many of us are familiar with. Okay, so the photo on the bottom right is a lot of people have said, hey, let's put LeBron in a football uniform. LeBron wouldn't just put on a football uniform and perform. He'd be the man people look to for influence and help motivate them towards reaching that common goal. So put LeBron anywhere, around anybody, and he's going to be the person everyone's drawn to because they want to be led by him. Okay, so that's the trait approach, is that you've got it or you really don't. We can probably see some issues with that. If we were in class, I would ask you, what do you think the perfect recipe is? Okay, so what characteristics or what dispositions do you think someone needs to be a perfect leader? Okay, what do you think? So one way to think about this is to think about maybe someone you envision as a perfect leader and then ask, what do they have? What do they have inherently? So what qualities have they probably had their entire life that make them a really good leader? Okay, but the secret is that there isn't really a perfect recipe. So there's no perfect recipe. There are some traits that certainly make people more likely to be leaders, but a lot of the time, leadership is something that develops. Okay, so that's how we're going to understand the behavioral approach. Behavioral approach is that, yes, there's some traits that make people more susceptible, but we can train those things. We can develop those behaviors so anybody can become a leader. Okay, you can make yourself into a leader. This is a really widely accepted approach, and the reason that I say that is because if you go into any Barnes & Noble or any bookstore around the corner, you're going to see a whole leadership section, a whole hundreds of books about how to be a good leader or a great leader. Okay? The fact that those books exist means that we have a belief that we can be leaders. So basically, it's learning how to become a leader and how to become an effective leader. Okay? So there's two broader categories of leadership behavior. So those kind of fall into those similar functions of leaders that I talked about previously. And the first one is consideration. And that's like consideration of the group that you're working within. And then initiating structure. That has to do more with setting up some group norms. If you remember that definition right there that says setting up rules for initiating structure, it's like setting up group norms and group roles within the team, if we're thinking about sport, for example. But behavioral approach is that you're made into a leader. You know, you may be born with some good traits, but let's just develop it and let's become the leader that we're all capable of becoming. And this approach is the situational approach. And the situational approach is basically saying that a certain situation is it's not really dependent on the traits that the person brings or like who it is, but it's the situation will basically make the traits and the skills of a certain individual really shine as a leader. Okay, so the situation is going to demand something, and certain people are going to rise to the top. And this example here is Jeffrey Saturday. And many of you might know him, many of you may not, but so just to give you a little heads up, he was the center for the Colts for a really long time, and then he was kind of in a way an unknown guy in the football organization just because he's a center. So often centers are not considered like the person that gets front of that poster, or he's not the face of the Colts organization. So he is certainly a reliable player, consistent player, played a ton, was a great guy, but we really saw him become a leader during the NFL lockout in 2011. So that's when he became the face of the NFL, and he represented all of the NFL players, because this guy's a really, really smart dude. And so all the players were happy to have him step up and lead them in this negotiation during the lockout. Okay, but before that, he's pretty relatively unknown. So the situations here are really different. One is, playing football, certainly where leaders can emerge and be appointed. But then the other one on the right is a very structured situation that demands someone with public speaking skills and who's probably a pretty smart person who can negotiate well with those higher up in the organization, and also someone who's well liked by his peers. Okay, so he was a good representation. He rose to the top there, and his football peers were really happy to have him there. Now, the interactional approach brings all of these three different approaches that I just described together. So interaction, it says it's an interaction of all of these things. Okay. So we know that the trait approach is saying, again, just that you either have it or you don't. The behavioral approach is saying, hey, there are some traits that are important to being a good leader, so let's develop them because we can all adopt these behaviors. And then the situational approach is really saying that the situation is going to demand some particular traits and behaviors, and we're going to have to find how we can best meet the demands of the situation or the environment through our own leadership skills. Okay, so what we often understand from the interactional approach is that there's really different styles of leadership, and we're going to not dive into this as much as I probably would have liked, but just to give you some exposure to this idea, basically what this is saying is that there's different leadership styles, and a good leader is able to change their style to fit the situation. So depending on the demands of the situation, a leader is going to be able to switch what kind of style they're using. Okay, so the first style that we're going to talk about here is a relationship-oriented leader, and if you think back to all the coaches that you've had, all the captains that you've had, you probably can remember if they're more relationship oriented, where they're really concerned about, being connected with every person on the team and feeling like their interactions with everybody are really positive, and they're very inclusive, versus someone who's more of a task oriented leader, who's really there to keep the structure together and manage really well and make sure that the team is doing everything they can to actually meet their objectives. So often we think if someone is more task-oriented, that seems more managerial in a way. But the blend of the two, kind of meet the functions that we just talked about earlier as well. So it's not that you are just one or the other, but some people tend to be more one than the other. And as you develop your leadership skills and you become a better leader, often you get more of a blend and a hybrid of the two. Now, this is the point in the lecture where I would have had you take the relationship-oriented leader and task-oriented leader scale, and it's on D2L. If you want to go ahead and do that, just to see who you are as a leader, because I believe you're all leaders. So go ahead and take that and follow the directions that are on there, and then come back to this lecture. Okay, and then I will show you what it kind of means. So we would certainly have expanded on this in class if we were in class. Okay, so this is how basically how you would score yourself on that little scale that we had you do. So you were asked to rank the items, I believe it was from 1 to 12, and then basically some of the questions you could probably tell were more oriented towards relationship and some more oriented toward task, and then you basically score them. So whichever one is your lower score, because 1 is supposed to be the one that you think represents you most, and 12, the one that represents you least. So your lowest score is more your style. Okay, are you shocked by this? Are you not surprised? Do you fall in the middle and have an equal number for both? If so, right on. You're probably a great leader. But nothing is wrong here, depending on what you get. It's just a little interesting thing to kind of play around with and see. Sometimes people are really surprised by what they get. Okay, now another idea, another model that I'm going to describe is the cognitive mediational model. Now, you all have probably heard the term mediation before. If you've taken, 371 or maybe even 250, any kind of statistical class, you've probably heard this term, or you've just heard it, colloquially. But mediation basically means that something is explained, a relationship between two variables is explained by a third variable. And in the case of the cognitive mediational model, as we understand it in leadership and in the sport context, is basically connecting coach behavior and athletes' responses to that behavior. So a coach is going to behave one way. How is that going to influence the response of the athletes? But that's a very straight, perfect relationship. But the cognitive mediational model says that there's something that happens in the middle there that actually influences how a coach's behavior influences an athlete's response. Okay? So basically what that thing is how athletes perceive their coach's behavior. So what really matters is the athlete's perceptions of the coach behavior. It doesn't actually matter what the coach does, it's how the athlete perceives it, which is going to influence their response. Okay? So basically the attitudes they have towards their coaches and the sport experience are affected by the perception and recall of their coaches' behaviors. Right? That's what the cognitive mediational model is in the sport context. Now this diagram looks a bit messy. It's the multi-dimensional model of sport leadership by Chelladurai. If we were in class, I'd ask you to kind of come up with a few sentences to summarize this. There are a lot of paths. So remember, we've talked about box and arrow diagrams in the past. And what we understand, box and arrow, how we understand them is that the arrows are saying that the thing to the left, in this case, the antecedents, basically then influence or predict the leader behavior, which then lead to a series of consequences. Okay, so it's kind of like it funnels down to one thing, or it kind of cascades in a way. Basically, one thing's influencing another, and that's how we can interpret these. But we can see a lot of crossing lines and a lot of confusing things here, possibly. But I want you to step back and just think about this model for a second. What we're looking at are antecedents, or the things that precede leader behavior. So what are the things that are actually going to influence the behavior we see exhibited by a leader? Okay. Then we see a leader exhibit certain behaviors. Those behaviors result in consequences. Okay, so there's three pieces to this model: the antecedents, the leader behavior, and the consequences that result. Okay, so we've already talked about a lot of these things, but I want you to just take a second, digest this, come up with a couple sentences to actually help you remember the flow of this diagram. Okay, so the things on the left that we're considering, the antecedents, we know, as we've talked about before, that the situation itself, or the characteristics of the situation, are going to call for certain types of leadership behaviors. No matter what, the situation is going to call for something. It's going to call for things that are required, but then it's also going to call for things that people would prefer. Okay, so people would prefer. So in the Jeffrey Saturday example, it's going to be required that he is able to speak well, and he's a very smart person who is able to negotiate. But it's probably preferred by the players that he is careful to use language and things that would represent them as an actual group of people rather than just numbers. So both things are influential to the actual behavior that he exhibits. Okay, the leadership characteristics. So this part of it, we're on the second part of our antecedents. The leadership characteristics are really the trait approach here. So if we're thinking leader characteristics, that's going to feed right into the actual behavior. There's no way that really links to the required behavior or the preferred behavior in the situation, but it goes right into our actual behavior. Okay, the last antecedent is the member characteristics. So what qualities of the group influence like what the required behavior is and what the preferred behavior is. Okay, so you can see that the situational characteristics and the member characteristics feed into the required behavior and the preferred behavior in the situation. As well as the leadership characteristics only feeding right into the actual behavior. But if we look at this plot, this links here and then down, and this links here and then up. So all three of these things in some way are linking right to that actual behavior. Okay, that actual behavior is going to feed into a result of some kind of consequence, which is a performance or satisfaction by a group. Okay, so that's a lot to take in. Do yourself a couple favors and get familiar with this. Understand the paths, right? Understand what examples might apply. Your book will give you some. Be able to summarize this diagram because it is pretty confusing, but just when you look at it, it can be confusing. But then when we break it apart, it makes sense. You're like, oh yeah, it would make sense that this feeds into this and this feeds into that. Okay, so just remember there's three pieces to it. Remember what those subdimensions are within that, and then ultimately that it impacts performance and satisfaction. Now, the transformational leadership is probably something we've heard many times in the past, but transformational leadership, and I'm not going to belabor it too much, but the way this is different is that transformational leaders are those who inspire and motivate. Now, this is an area of leadership that is very sexy to many people. Basically, we want to push people to be transformational leaders. Okay, so they're really the people who are truly able to inspire those to follow a collective vision, right? And there's usually really great interpersonal relationships, and they execute being a leader very well in many different situations. So you can see that there's a whole slew of guidelines for becoming or for being transformational leaders. And the key thing is that there's an inspirational piece. But a lot of other things have to happen for someone to be a transformational leader. So take a look at this list of things or the guidelines for being a transformational leader, and think if you believe you've had someone who you would consider a transformational leader during your sport experience or your education or any situation where you believe a leadership or a leader was present. Okay, so there's a ton of guidelines, but good leaders exhibit these things. So now, just to summarize, we're going to summarize with this diagram. That's a diagram about what effective leadership is. Okay, so now we've come up with all of these models that say this explains this, this is what you have to do here, this is this, and this is what leadership is. This is how we understand it. But this little diagram is how we understand what effective leadership is. Okay, pretty simple. There's four quadrants within this circle, all surrounding effective leadership. So when we go to this first quadrant, the leader's qualities, we know, as we've learned from the trait approach, that although we think that there's probably a perfect recipe, there really isn't. However, the behavioral approach says, hey, there are some, so let's develop them. It's not like it's not like you're born a leader, but there are some qualities that are going to make you a better leader. So let's develop those things. And what you see here is a whole list of those that have been found repeatedly as qualities or personal dispositions that people believe make others good leaders. And I wouldn't disagree. I think that all of these things are super important to being a good leader. Now, just think if you would add anything else to that, okay? So having these things would likely make you a more effective leader. That's how we interpret this little piece of the pie. Okay, so the next piece is the situational factors, right? So remember that situational piece that we talked about before. And I will come back to this slide after I discuss the next one, but basically the things that need to be considered in our sport world that we're going to live in here for this understanding is that there are some things within the situation and environment that are going to dictate the type of leadership, and some of those things might be team versus individual sport. So if you're in a team, they might prefer a certain type of leadership, or they might function better with a certain type of leadership. If it's an individual sport, they might function under a different type of leadership. Interactive versus coactive, they might prefer a task-oriented leader in an interactive an interactive group. Group size, sometimes if you have a really big group or a really small group, you're going to have to adjust your leadership style. And I don't know what sports y'all played, clearly not hockey, I remember that. But depending on the group size, it's often going to dictate your leadership style. Okay. The available time. So if you have very, very, very little time with a group and you're a leader, likely developing really sound relationships and focusing on the relationship piece is not going to be a productive thing to do. So if there's very little time, you're going to want to be a task-oriented leader. Okay? Whether people like it or not, you still have a job, and the limited time would say, hey, we got to get this job done. Let's focus on how we do that. If we had more time, then we'd make sure that everyone's good, we're all connected, etc. Okay? So then the other thing is leadership tradition. So some situations, there's going to be a classic way that a leader or leadership is exhibited, and that's really hard to change. So it's really hard to develop a new one, but some situations are just going to call for a certain type of leadership tradition. Now this third quadrant, talks about leadership styles. And now I know a lot of you are doing your term papers on leadership style, so take a look at this section of your textbook and take a look at this slide for more info. But there's two that I really want to talk about first: the autocratic and the democratic leadership styles. The autocratic style is basically like the coach. Let's just say our coach is the leader in this situation. The coach is making all of the decisions and calling all the shots on his or her own. Okay, so there's no inclusion of the team. There's no consideration of what they want. It's their way or the highway, essentially. If we're looking at the democratic style, basically what we're saying here is kind of the opposite of the autocratic, where coaches include their athletes in the decision making. So now I'm using decision making as an example here, but it could be anything. So it's basically like in an autocratic leadership style, coaches don't really consider the needs and wants of the athletes, but they really consider only themselves. Where in a democratic leadership style, they do consider what the athletes need and want. Now I think about my college experience, and I was on a team. Everybody was really, really miserable. We hated our coach for so many reasons, but one of the key reasons was because he was an autocratic coach and never, ever, ever considered how we felt about things or what we thought about things or how tired we were or how beat down we felt. So he was very autocratic, if I had to go back and reflect on that. And then there's two different styles, and you can use both of these as simultaneously in a way, but there's consultative individual and then consultative group. So it's exactly what it sounds like, and that consultative individual is a leadership style where the leader will consult with an individual player and then make a decision. So if we're thinking about a coach and a captain, this would be like maybe there's a conflict on the team and the coach is like, you know what, I have to figure this out. I have to figure out how we're going to handle this, but I think I should consult the captain. I'm not going to consult the whole team, but I'm going to consult the captain. Another example would be the consultative group, which is where the coach consults the entire group, okay, and then makes a decision. So it could be something about your general fatigue as a group, and the coach thinking, I might give them Sunday practice off, I might not. Let's go take a gander, let's go see how they're feeling about this, and then make a decision. So you can see that they kind of reflect back onto the autocratic the democratic style a little bit. So consulting your athletes is reflective of a democratic style. Y'all can come up with a lot of examples to fit within these. Go ahead and do that, because in class I would certainly ask you to do that. And the reason that I have you do that is because if you come up with your own examples that map to these, it's going to help you remember them a little bit better. Okay. Now I'm going to click back one slide very, very quickly. Just to talk about, or how you would think that, I just want you to think about how a team in an individual sport what they would prefer in terms of the leadership style. Okay, I'm not going to give it to you, but I just want you to think about it, because the type of sport, the type of team that's there is going to dictate leadership style as well. So all of these things are. So think back on that, map it back to that, and come up with your own opinion. Okay, and then the last quadrant is just the actual characteristics of the members. Okay, so we saw in that multidimensional model of leadership, we saw that the members' characteristics was down there in the bottom left for the antecedents to leadership behavior. This is also mapping to that. So for effective leadership, we do need to consider that. And those things, like simple things like the sex of your athletes, or how old they are, or how long they've been playing their sport, or anything like that needs to be considered when you're exhibiting certain leadership styles or behaviors. Now think about why this might be the case. So use something like age and experience when thinking about the team and what leadership style you would use. Now think about this example. If you have a team of 5-year-old t-ball players, they're very young and they have very limited experience. Compare that to a, let's see, the World Series winners for this year. All right, the MLB World Series. Those guys are talented. They've been playing ball for a long time, and they are just like highly skilled and much, much older. Okay, so you would probably be able to use different leadership styles with those different groups. Okay, so think about those things. It has to do with your cognitive development as well. It has so many things influence the leadership style that you use. Okay. So I apologize that we've had to do this lecture online, but I do want to keep us on pace just so we don't get too far away, and we can keep doing those term papers, which are probably your favorite. But just as a reminder, just a couple reminders, the exam is still Tuesday, February 5th, okay? And then the second part of your term paper is February 19th. So be working on that. The second part is really focusing on the figuring out those, annotating those bibliographies, I believe. So that should be you finding all the articles that map to the topic that you're interested in, and just simplifying and summarizing those. There's a diagram on the instruction, so go ahead and visit that. And as always, think about what the key takeaways are from this lecture. You should be able to walk away from the lecture saying, like, here are 3 things that I learned that are really important, or 3 things that stood out to me. But as I said before in the beginning, make sure that you go back through your textbook and you see where there are gaps. Okay, go fill in the gaps, as you should always be doing, because we can't cover it all. But hopefully you got some good info and you're able to fill in the rest of your slide set. All right, have a great day. Stay toasty. We miss you, and we'll see you on Tuesday.